The month of August is almost upon us, and that means one thing in Formula One circles at least, and pretty much everybody else, at least across Europe, goes off on holiday. Me personally, I'm going to go and sit in a fishing port somewhere where there's lots of mountains and no racing cars, which is unfortunate because that's all I like to think about when I have any spare time. And that's what a lot of teams will be thinking about as they look back over the first 14 races of the season. So I thought, before we all take a break, let's take a look at those beautiful 10 racing cars that we've been studying all through the races so far this season. And our data team here have come up with an absolutely fascinating piece of data just to take a look at how the cars have developed relative to one another as the season has progressed. Now, this data runs from Bahrain, the opening race, to Hungary just a week ago, the last time out where we've got a complete data set for. Now, what we see is, as everybody sort of knows, Red Bull is the fastest car overall, just about. But some teams have developed closer to Red Bull relative to the fastest car, and some teams have gone a bit backwards, hence the green and red on this table. And I thought we'd talk through some of the cars specifically. And let's start with the team that seems to have made the biggest gain so far, and that is, of course, the papaya team that is McLaren. No surprise, they've been picking up race wins and super strong points, and when they sort out their team orders, they're getting 1-2s around the really challenging Hungaroring circuit. McLaren really started to move forward, as they sort of did last year, with a very effective upgrade package at the Miami Grand Prix earlier this year. We took a really deep dive on that elsewhere on this channel, so you can find that and have a more in-depth look at it. But the whole rear bodywork package changed, a lot of the aerodynamic surfaces changed right across the car. But once McLaren managed to work out how to get the best out of the setup of the car and how the drivers managed to drive that setup, the car really started to transform in terms of performance and truly is now a Red Bull beater. And I think there's a lot more still to come from McLaren. And I think one of the big issues with McLaren is nobody really understands why their development process is so much more effective than anybody else's, but it's certainly a major aerodynamic process for that team, which isn't the case for every team on the grid. So let's take a look back at the next fastest team, Mercedes, gaining 1.5 tenths on average per lap across the season so far. Actually, most of that 1.5 tenths improvement has come in recent races. But Mercedes hasn't bought any massive upgrade packages this season, sticking to lots of iterative bits here, a beam wing here, a slight bubble on the front of the car there, and they seem to be really effective. But actually what I think the secret to the Mercedes packages is this hump on the nose. We've talked about it a little bit more recently, and there is a video going into it in a bit more detail. But what I think is going on is at the start of the season, Mercedes had basically two options on car setup. The car would either work really, really well in slow corners and was a bit rubbish in the medium and high-speed corners, or was great in the medium and high-speed corners, but didn't work at all in the slow-speed corners. That characteristic seems to have gone away since they made some invisible upgrade to the car. But when that happened, we saw this large hump appear on the nose. Officially, it's all to do with the driver cooling duct, as you can see underneath the 44 of Lewis Hamilton's car there. I think there's a lot more going on with Mercedes, and that's where they've made their big gains. It's mechanical improvement as well as subtle aerodynamic, iterative aerodynamic improvement. I think that's a really important factor. Iterative development is not the approach every team is taking, though Ferrari has switched to an iterative process, but not by choice. The Italian team introduced an absolutely massive upgrade package in Imola. You can see this is the Imola bodywork, and you can really identify the two different bodywork packages from the version they started the season with. This is the beginning of the season in Bahrain. You've got these very smooth engine covers and cooling louvres, and then post Imola they had this much more sculpted design, and sometimes they're playing around with the cooling exits, changing around the sculpting, changing around the shapes, huge changes on the floor, to the side pod, to a lot of the car. Problem for Ferrari is those changes didn't really work. They did make the car faster, but the drivers complained that it made it undrivable. It was bouncing around on the circuit. And Ferrari actually had to take all of those upgrade packages off, revert to the original Imola specification, and then slowly develop in an iterative process going forward to recover that performance. But as you can see, that's not really worked. They're still quite a long way off Red Bull and falling further behind. Speaking of falling further behind, the RB team, they dropped back over a tenth. Their upgrade packages haven't worked particularly well either. They've had a few big packages, none of them really netting the great results. Aston Martin there, it looks absolutely awful for them because it is. They've lost half a second relative to Red Bull. Even with some pretty chunky upgrade packages, it's just not working for the British team, and I'm not sure they really understand why. But this is the exact same characteristic we saw with Aston Martin's development last year. So clearly something's not quite right with their process when it comes to car development, and that is something that team I know is actively looking into. Speaking of packages not really working, but actually they are working, but they're only working as well as everybody else is. The Haas team, they've had one really big package of upgrade parts, and essentially it's left them exactly the same distance to Red Bull as when they started the season. That's not to say that the upgrades on the Haas have failed, it just says that their development rate has been exactly the same as that of Red Bull Racing. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think it's actually pretty impressive for a small team like Haas to match the world champions on rate of development. A team, though, that has made huge improvements, not all of them aerodynamic. In fact, the biggest improvement for the Alpine team is the car itself. The Alpine team started the season with a massively overweight car. But by the time we got to the Belgian Grand Prix, not only was the car fitted with a new livery, it had lots of weight-saving parts on. Now, the team hasn't really gone into detail about exactly how they've saved that weight. I think rumours of adamantium being inserted in some of the uprights to reduce weight probably aren't true because that fictional metal wouldn't pass the FIA's regulations on maximum material density, so I don't think that's going to be part of it. However, that weight loss, that weight saving for Alpine has really moved them forward. The car is still massively struggling. You can see how far down this table it is, so it's still not really performing where it should be, and there's lots of talk around that team, and I think that's as part of the result of that. Williams, they've fallen back ever so slightly, perhaps not able to keep up the development rate of the fastest teams. I think a bit more to come from that British team, but they've always been quite good on high-speed circuits, so a dry Spa should suit Williams, as should Monza and a few of the circuits later in the year. Las Vegas and Mexico City could help them out quite nicely as the season goes on. So maybe the circuit types haven't really favoured Williams. And then the team at the bottom of the table here is Sauber. Now, we need to have a chat about Sauber, don't we? The team which becomes Audi in 2026 is really struggling. They've had some massive upgrade packages in recent races. The most obvious sign of that is going from this low-slung, some people call it the underbite style of side pod duct, going to this overbite style in recent races. Now, this is just an indication of the level of changes they've had on the car. New floor, new bodywork, the whole back end of the car, and the front end to an extent. The front wings have changed quite significantly. But it's not really working, is it? They're still a long way down off everybody else. And there has been some big change at that team. Andreas Seidel, the team boss, he's gone, replaced by Mattia Binotto, formerly of Ferrari. Will it make all the difference? Well, they've got an awful lot of work to do. But the team they're all trying to beat, of course, is the team we haven't really talked about, and that is, of course, Red Bull Racing. Last time out in Hungary, Red Bull had the biggest upgrade of anybody we've seen all season, making a pretty much fundamental change to the design of the car. Most obviously seen from looking at this shot of the rear bodywork, and when you take a look at the design of that, how the car started the season, and how Sergio Perez has had it all season long. He didn't get the upgrade in Hungary. And then you compare it to the Max Verstappen version that they used last time out in Hungary. It looks like two different racing cars. Massive change, fundamental differences in the way it's laid out. Didn't really work brilliantly for Red Bull, did it? Even the way they've changed their cooling layout through the season has been absolutely fascinating to watch. But Red Bull now having to push harder than they've pushed recently at all, indeed under this current rule set, just to stay ahead. And of course the season is getting closer. There's been 7 different winners in the first 13 races. But there's also been 7 victories for Max Verstappen. And with more to come, it seems, from that big Red Bull upgrade, it seems hard to bet against more Red Bull domination in the second half of the season. But it is, as I say, going to get ever closer. So perhaps some of those upgrades coming for the other teams will shut down the Flying Dutchman.